In the picturesque Oak Ridge Valley, elderly farmer James Harrison conceals the secrets of the land in his weathered notebook, trying to preserve his ancestors' legacy after losing his own farm under mysterious circumstances. When arrogant auctioneer Vincent Blackwood publicly humiliates James, no one suspects that within 15 minutes, a black government motorcade will shift the balance of power, revealing a shocking connection between the disgraced farmer and the influential governor. What begins as a simple dispute over water rights soon exposes a sinister web of hidden land deals threatening not only the local ecosystem, but the future of the entire valley, proving an ancient truth. The soil bears witness to our deeds, even when people choose to forget their sins. Before we begin, write in the comments where you're listening to our stories from. Subscribe to our channel, it's free, and you can always change your mind. Enjoy the story. The soil bears witness to our deeds. The weathered words hung in the autumn air as elderly James Harrison stood frozen in humiliation, surrounded by snickering investors in tailored suits. But 15 minutes later, when a motorcade of black government vehicles roared into the parking lot, auctioneer Vincent Blackwood's smug expression shattered as the distinguished man who emerged introduced himself. "I'm Governor Daniel Harrison, James Harrison's brother, and I believe we need to discuss your auction practices before you sell another acre of my brother's former family land." Pinecrest County Auction House stood as a monument to rural prosperity in the heart of Oak Ridge Valley, New Hampshire. Its red brick facade and gleaming modern addition represented the changing face of agricultural commerce, where family farms were increasingly being acquired by corporate interests. The original farming families who had worked the land for generations now found themselves outbid and marginalized in the very community they had built. Vincent Blackwood's premier land auctions were considered the most prestigious sales events in the Tri-County area. At 55, with his designer suits and Wall Street connections, he had transformed what was once a straightforward farm auction into an exclusive event where multi-million-dollar properties changed hands over champagne. His reputation for delivering clean properties to developers, land without complications from local interests, had made him the go-to auctioneer for corporate buyers. On this crisp October morning, Blackwood moved through the gathering crowd, his Italian leather shoes marking him as distinctly different from the few remaining local farmers who had come to witness the sale of yet another historic property. "Today," he announced as he took his position at the podium, "we present an extraordinary opportunity, the Eagle Creek Estate, 320 acres of prime agricultural land with exceptional development potential. We'll start the bidding at $3 million. The attendees, mostly representatives from investment firms and agricultural corporations, settled into their seats. The Eagle Creek Estate was known to have exceptional water rights and a strategic location near the planned highway expansion. The auction house doors opened, and an elderly man in worn overalls and a faded plaid shirt stepped inside. James Harrison, 78, moved slowly toward the back row, his weathered hands clutching a small leather notebook. His faded blue eyes surveyed the room with quiet dignity, taking in the transformation of the auction house he had visited countless times throughout his farming career. Blackwood noticed the newcomer and frowned slightly before continuing his elaborate description of the property's development potential. As the bidding began, corporate representatives raised the price in $100,000 increments as Blackwood orchestrated the proceedings with practiced precision. During a brief pause between parcels, James raised his hand. "Excuse me," he called out, his voice carrying surprising strength despite his age. "There's a historical watershed covenant on the southeastern section that restricts non-agricultural development." A murmur ran through the crowd as Blackwood's smile tightened. "Sir, we've thoroughly vetted all legal aspects of these properties. If you're not here to bid, I must ask you to refrain from disrupting the proceedings." "I'm not trying to disrupt," James replied calmly, "but I helped draft that covenant with the Eagle family in 1982. It was registered with the county to preserve the watershed. Blackwood's irritation became visible. "Sir, our legal team has cleared all titles. Unless you're prepared to participate with a minimum bid of $3 million, I must ask you to remain silent." James persisted quietly. "The covenant exists. Anyone buying that land should know they can't develop the South Quarter for non-agricultural use. It protects the water supply for 5 downstream farms." Blackwood stepped away from his podium, approaching James directly. "Mr. Harrison." "James Harrison?" "Mr. Harrison, this is a premium auction for serious investors. We're not here to debate ancient history or sentimental attachments to the land. The legal details have been handled by professionals." "I was on the county water board for 22 years, James explained. "That covenant exists to protect—" "What it exists to do," Blackwood interrupted coldly, "is irrelevant. These parcels will be sold today, and the buyers will develop them according to current regulations, not some handshake agreement from 40 years ago." James opened his notebook. "It wasn't a handshake agreement. I have the original documentation right here, signed by Judge Watkins and registered with—" "Security!" Blackwood called over his shoulder. "Please escort this gentleman out. He's disrupting a private business event." 2 men in blazers approached, as shocked murmurs rippled through the room. "I'm simply providing relevant information about the property," James protested mildly. "Potential buyers deserve to know." Blackwood's voice took on a dismissive tone intended to be heard by his wealthy clients. "Mr. Harrison, I understand that watching these old properties change hands must be difficult for certain residents. But this is the nature of progress. We don't need weathered farmers with empty pockets wasting our time at a premium land auction." A pained expression crossed James's face at the public humiliation, but he carefully closed his notebook and stood with dignity. "My pockets may be empty, Mr. Blackwood, but so is your understanding of this land and its importance to our community. The community is changing, Mr. Harrison. Perhaps it's time you accepted that not everyone belongs in the new Oak Ridge Valley." Blackwood turned to the security personnel. "Please see Mr. Harrison out. We have valuable clients whose time we're wasting." As James was escorted toward the door, he paused and looked back at the room full of investors. "The soil bears witness to our deeds, whether you acknowledge it or not. The land remembers even when people choose to forget." Blackwood returned to his podium with a tight smile. "My apologies for the interruption, ladies and gentlemen. Some people struggle to accept that land, like anything else, belongs to those who can afford to buy it. Now, shall we continue with Parcel 4? Outside in the parking lot, James stood beside his old pickup truck, his face composed despite the humiliation he had just endured. He pulled out his phone and made a call. "Daniel, it's Jim. I'm sorry to bother you when I know you're busy, but there's a situation at the old Eagle Creek property. Blackwood Auctions is selling it without disclosing the watershed covenant." He listened for a moment. No, don't worry about that. They just asked me to leave." "Yes, I'm fine. Just concerned about the water rights for the downstream farms." As James ended the call, he didn't notice Vincent Blackwood watching from the auction house window, a satisfied smirk on his face as he saw the old farmer climbing into his battered truck. In Blackwood's mind, he had just eliminated a potential complication to his perfectly orchestrated land sale. He had no idea that his smug certainty was about to be shattered in less than 15 minutes. The auction resumed its steady rhythm after James Harrison's departure. Vincent Blackwood had quickly re-established control of the room, his confidence seemingly unshaken by the brief disruption. Corporate representatives continued their bidding on the fertile parcels of Eagle Creek Estate, with prices climbing well beyond what any local farmer could hope to match. "Parcel 5 includes the original homestead and surrounding 50 acres, Blackwood announced, his voice carrying the practiced enthusiasm of a man who knew he was about to make a substantial commission. This section features the historic barn, which could be converted to an exceptional events venue or corporate retreat. We'll start the bidding at $2 million. In the parking lot, James Harrison sat in his truck, his weathered hands still gripping the steering wheel. He hadn't started the engine yet. Instead, He was looking at an old photograph tucked into the sun visor. A picture of a much younger James standing with his late wife and their sons, Daniel and Michael, beside the Eagle Creek Pond. The Harrison family had farmed adjacent land for 3 generations before economic hardship forced them to sell 15 years ago. James wasn't fighting for his own property anymore. That battle had been lost years earlier. He was fighting for the principles that had governed land use in Pinecrest County for generations. The understanding that water was a shared resource that demanded stewardship rather than ownership. The covenant he had helped establish with the Eagle family had been designed to protect not just the land itself, but the entire watershed that sustained 5 downstream farms. His reverie was interrupted by the distant sound of vehicles approaching. James glanced in his rearview mirror and was startled to see a procession of black SUVs turning into the auction house parking lot. State trooper motorcycles flanked the convoy, their lights flashing as they escorted a particularly sleek vehicle in the center of the formation. "Oh, Daniel," James murmured, recognizing the gubernatorial motorcade. "You didn't have to do this." What would happen next would change the course of Oak Ridge Valley forever. Inside the auction house, Vincent Blackwood was in his element. Having just secured a $2.4 million bid on the homestead parcel. "Excellent! That's $2.4 million from Heartland Agricultural Investments. Do I hear 2.5? Remember, ladies and gentlemen, this is prime conversion property with historical character that exempts it from certain zoning restrictions." A representative from Eastern Consolidated raised his paddle. $2.5 million. I have $2.5 million. Do I hear… Blackwood's patter was interrupted by the sound of vehicles pulling up outside. The auction house's large windows offered a clear view of the parking lot, where attendees could now see the procession of official vehicles coming to a stop. 2 state troopers in formal uniform exited first, followed by several staff members in professional attire. "As I was saying," Blackwood continued, attempting to recapture the room's attention, "now we have $2.5 million. Do I hear 2.6? But the bidders were distracted now, murmuring amongst themselves as they watched the scene unfolding in the parking lot. When the center vehicle's door opened and a man in a tailored suit emerged, several people in the room audibly gasped. "Is that the governor?" someone whispered, loudly enough to be heard throughout the room. Blackwood's confident demeanor faltered momentarily. "Ladies and gentlemen, please. We have important business to conduct. I'm sure whatever official matter is taking place outside can proceed without our attention. Now do I hear $2.6 million for the homestead parcel?" The auction house doors swung open and the 2 state troopers entered, scanning the room with professional detachment. Behind them came a man in his early 50s, his salt and pepper hair meticulously groomed, his bearing commanding instant respect. Governor Daniel Harrison had his brother's blue eyes and the same quiet dignity, though his was now amplified by the power of his office. Flanking him were his chief of staff and the state's attorney general, both carrying leather portfolios. James Harrison entered last, looking somewhat embarrassed by the dramatic entrance, but resolute nonetheless. Blackwood's face went through a rapid sequence of expressions: surprise, confusion, alarm, and finally, an attempt at professional courtesy. "Governor Harrison, this is an unexpected honor. We're in the middle of an auction, but of course, you're welcome to observe. Perhaps your staff would like to place a bid on behalf of the state park system." Governor Harrison ignored Blackwood entirely, instead turning to address the room at large. "Good morning, everyone. I apologize for interrupting your proceedings, but an urgent matter of public interest has come to my attention." His voice carried natural authority without raising its volume. "I've been informed that this auction may be proceeding without full disclosure of legal encumbrances on the property." Blackwood moved quickly from behind his podium. "Governor, I assure you that all legal requirements have been meticulously followed. Our title research is impeccable. Perhaps there's been some misunderstanding." "There's no misunderstanding, Mr. Blackwood," the governor replied coolly. "I've just spoken with the county records office. They've confirmed the existence of a watershed protection covenant on significant portions of the Eagle Creek estate, specifically parcels 2, 3, and 7 of your current offering. The Attorney General stepped forward, opening his portfolio. We have certified copies of the covenant documents right here, filed in 1982 and never rescinded. The covenant explicitly prohibits non-agricultural development on the southeastern quadrant and requires maintenance of the existing wetlands. A wave of murmurs swept through the audience, particularly among the corporate bidders who had already committed millions to parcels that now appeared to have significant restrictions. Blackwood's confident facade began to crack. "Governor Harrison, with all due respect, my legal team conducted thorough due diligence. If such a covenant exists, it would have been disclosed in our materials." "It should have been," Governor Harrison agreed, "which raises serious questions about your auction practices. Either your legal team missed critical encumbrances, which constitutes negligence, or these restrictions were deliberately omitted, which would constitute fraud." The room had gone completely silent now, all eyes moving between Blackwood and the governor. "I don't appreciate these insinuations, Governor," Blackwood said, struggling to maintain his composure. "These properties have been properly vetted according to standard industry practices." "Industry practices don't supersede state law, Mr. Blackwood," the Attorney General interjected. "And state law requires full disclosure of all encumbrances before sale." Governor Harrison turned to address the bidders directly. "Ladies and gentlemen, in the interest of transparency and to prevent any of you from making investments based on incomplete information, I'm exercising my authority to request a temporary halt to these proceedings pending a full review of the property records." He nodded to the state troopers, who moved to stand on either side of Blackwood's podium. "This is not an action I take lightly, but as governor, I have a responsibility to ensure that all business conducted in our state adheres to our laws, particularly when it involves resources as vital as our watershed." Blackwood looked around desperately, seeking support from the crowd, but the corporate representatives were already on their phones, clearly consulting with their legal departments. "This is unprecedented interference in a private business transaction," he protested. "On the contrary," Governor Harrison replied calmly, "this is the state fulfilling its obligation to protect both consumers and natural resources. My brother attempted to provide this information through appropriate channels, and you had him removed." All eyes turned to James Harrison, who stood quietly at the back of the room, still clutching his leather notebook. There was a moment of collective realization as the bidders connected the elderly farmer with the governor. "Your brother," Blackwood stammered, the color draining from his face as he finally made the connection himself. "Yes, Mr. Blackwood! James Harrison, the weathered farmer with empty pockets you so dismissively ejected, is my brother. He served on the county water board for over 2 decades and helped draft the very covenant you failed to disclose." The governor's voice remained measured, but there was steel beneath his calm exterior. More importantly, he was trying to ensure that all parties to this sale had accurate information, something you actively prevented. Blackwood looked desperately toward his legal counsel, who had sunk low in his chair, already recognizing the severity of the situation. "Governor Harrison," Blackwood began, attempting to recover. "Had I known Mr. Harrison was your brother—" "Had I known," the governor interrupted sharply, "would you have treated him with the respect every citizen deserves? Would you have dismissed his concerns because of his clothes, or his age, or his empty pockets? Or would you have listened only because of his connection to me?" Blackwood had no answer. "Your auction is suspended pending review," the governor continued. "The Attorney General's office will be examining all sales conducted by Blackwood Auctions over the past 5 years to ensure proper disclosure practices were followed." He turned to the assembled bidders. "I apologize for any inconvenience this causes to those of you who traveled here in good faith. The state will ensure that when these properties are eventually sold, all legal encumbrances will be clearly documented." As the corporate representatives began gathering their materials and filing out, many casting accusatory glances at Blackwood. The auctioneer made one last desperate attempt. "Governor, surely we can resolve this without such drastic measures. Perhaps a brief recess to review the documentation your brother has provided?" "Mr. Blackwood," Governor Harrison said, his voice now carrying the full weight of his office. "This isn't merely about documentation. It's about the systematic dismissal of local knowledge and the disregard for land stewardship that has characterized too many transactions in this county. My office has received numerous complaints about your auction practices, but until today, we lacked clear evidence." He gestured to the state troopers. "These officers will secure the auction records while the Attorney General's staff conducts their initial review. You're welcome to contact your attorney, but I suggest you cooperate fully." As the room quickly emptied, James Harrison approached his brother. "I didn't call you to shut down the auction. I just wanted someone to verify the covenant's existence." The governor smiled at his brother, briefly dropping his official demeanor. "I know, Jim, but when you told me they'd thrown you out for trying to share vital information about the property, it confirmed what we've been hearing about Blackwood's practices for years." He lowered his voice. "We've had complaints from 3 counties about his failure to disclose environmental restrictions and indigenous heritage sites on properties he's auctioned. We just needed clear evidence." James glanced over at Blackwood, who was now engaged in an intense conversation with his legal counsel. "He's built quite a business selling off our community piece by piece." "Well, that business model is about to change," Governor Harrison replied. "The Attorney General has been looking for a case like this to establish stronger disclosure requirements for agricultural land sales." Across the room, Blackwood looked up and caught James's eye. The auctioneer's expression had transformed from smugness to something approaching fear as he watched the state officials boxing up his records. In the span of 15 minutes, his carefully constructed world of exclusive deals and selective disclosures had begun to crumble. James felt no triumph, only a quiet satisfaction that the land might now be treated with the respect it deserved. He opened his weathered notebook, showing his brother the original covenant language he had helped draft decades earlier. "The soil bears witness to our deeds," he said softly, echoing the words he had spoken when being escorted out, "even when people try to forget." Governor Harrison nodded, understanding the deeper meaning in his brother's words. "And sometimes," he added, "it just needs someone willing to speak for it." Outside, the sun illuminated the rolling fields of the Eagle Creek estate, the land at the center of the controversy stretching toward the horizon. Land that had been tended by generations of farmers who understood that ownership was temporary, but stewardship was eternal. The governor's convoy remained parked outside the auction house, a visible reminder that even in changing times, some principles remained worth defending. What had begun as a confrontation over a single property was about to transform an entire community's relationship with the land they called home. But the story of James Harrison and Vincent Blackwood was only beginning. Neither man could have predicted how their confrontation would ultimately reshape not just their own lives, but the future of rural America itself. The weeks following Governor Harrison's dramatic intervention at the Pinecrest County Auction House brought profound changes to Oak Ridge Valley. What had begun as a confrontation over a single property quickly expanded into a broader examination of land sale practices throughout the region. For Vincent Blackwood, the transformation was both professional and personal, beginning with the most uncomfortable meeting of his career. 3 days after the suspended auction, Blackwood found himself sitting in the state capitol's Department of Agriculture conference room, surrounded by officials from various regulatory agencies. The Attorney General presided, flanked by environmental compliance officers and representatives from the State Real Estate Commission. "Mr. Blackwood," the Attorney General began, "our preliminary review has identified concerning patterns in your auction disclosures. Of the 27 farm properties your company has sold in the past 3 years, 14 appear to have had environmental covenants or water rights restrictions that were not properly disclosed to buyers." Blackwood shifted uncomfortably in his expensive suit, acutely aware that his usual intimidating presence held no power here. The rich mahogany table, once a symbol of authority and prestige at similar meetings, now felt like the witness stand in a trial where he was the defendant. The morning sun streamed through tall windows, illuminating dust particles that danced in the air, much like the fragments of his career that now seemed to hang in suspension. "Those were oversights, not deliberate omissions," he insisted, hearing the defensive tone in his own voice. "Agricultural property transactions are complex and—" "Which is precisely why proper disclosure is essential," interrupted the real estate commissioner, a stern woman whose reputation for integrity was well known throughout the state. "Buyers rely on your expertise and due diligence, particularly when they're corporate entities unfamiliar with local land conditions." Blackwood nodded mechanically, understanding the precarious position he now occupied. The state could revoke his auctioneer's license, effectively ending his lucrative business overnight. Around him, the faces showed little sympathy. These were professionals who had long suspected practices like his, but had lacked the clear evidence to act until now. "We're not here to put you out of business, Mr. Blackwood," the Attorney General continued, as if reading his thoughts. "We're here to ensure that moving forward, all land transactions include full transparency about legal encumbrances and environmental responsibilities." What stung most wasn't the threat of punishment, but the realization that his professional reputation, built over decades of careful cultivation, was now tarnished. The prestigious clients who had once sought his exclusive services were suddenly distant, unwilling to be associated with controversial business practices. His phone had stopped ringing. Invitations to elite social gatherings had mysteriously disappeared. Even his country club acquaintances now found reasons to cut conversations short when he approached. "We are implementing new protocols for agricultural auctions statewide," explained the Department of Agriculture representative, a younger man whose family had farmed in the region for generations. "All properties will undergo independent environmental assessment before sale, with results made available to all potential bidders." As the meeting concluded, the Attorney General remained behind, fixing Blackwood with a penetrating gaze. The late morning light cast half her face in shadow, giving her words additional weight. "Governor Harrison could have pursued this matter far more aggressively. He chose instead to focus on systemic reform rather than individual penalties." Blackwood managed a tight smile. "I appreciate his restraint." "It wasn't restraint, Mr. Blackwood. It was wisdom. The governor believes you have expertise that could benefit the state's transition to more sustainable agricultural practices, assuming you're willing to adapt your business model." The comment stayed with Blackwood as he drove back to Oak Ridge Valley, the rolling countryside passing outside his car window. For the first time in years, he really looked at the land, not assessing its development potential or calculating per-acre values, but seeing the interconnected ecosystem that James Harrison had tried to protect. Farmland stretched in patchwork patterns across the valley, interrupted by the silver threads of streams and the dark green clusters of woodlots. These weren't just parcels to be sold and developed. They were working landscapes shaped by generations of human hands in cooperation with natural forces. Each field told a story of seasonal change, of careful cultivation, of weather events remembered in local lore. Near the village of Marion Crossing, Blackwood passed a farm where 3 generations worked together harvesting early summer vegetables. He slowed his Mercedes, watching as the grandfather instructed a young boy in the art of determining when a squash was perfectly ripe. Was this the kind of knowledge James Harrison had tried to preserve? Knowledge not found in land surveys or soil samples, but passed down through careful observation and mentorship? The following morning, Blackwood arrived at his office earlier than usual, finding several cancellations in his inbox from corporate clients unwilling to risk association with his firm until the state investigation concluded. His assistant Meredith, who had worked with him for 15 years, approached his desk with obvious discomfort. The Heartland agricultural representative called to withdraw from the Miller Farm auction, she said, placing the cancellation notice on his desk. That's the third major buyer to pull out this week. Blackwood nodded grimly. And I suspect it won't be the last. Vincent, Meredith hesitated, using his first name, something she rarely did in the office. What are we going to do? If this continues, we'll have to start laying people off by the end of the month. Before Blackwood could respond, Meredith's expression changed to one of surprise. Oh, and Mr. Harrison is here to see you. James Harrison. I told him you were busy, but he insisted it was important. James Harrison? Blackwood repeated, genuinely confused. You mean the farmer from the Eagle Creek auction? The governor's brother? Meredith nodded, looking as puzzled as he felt. Should I tell him you're unavailable? Blackwood considered the offer for a moment. His instinct was to avoid any further confrontation with the Harrison family. But curiosity won out. No, show him in. This should be interesting. James Harrison entered Blackwood's office with the same quiet dignity he had shown at the auction, his weathered hands still carrying the small leather notebook. Without the pressure of the auction environment, Blackwood noticed details he had previously overlooked. The intelligence in the old farmer's eyes, the careful precision in his movements, the subtle indicators of a lifetime spent in thoughtful stewardship of the land. He wore the same faded plaid shirt and overalls from the auction, not as a statement, but simply because they were his regular clothes. The contrast between his weathered appearance and Blackwood's pristine office couldn't have been more stark. The farmer seeming almost out of place among the polished mahogany and crystal deal trophies that celebrated million-dollar property sales. Mr. Harrison, Blackwood said, standing awkwardly, I didn't expect to see you again. I expect not, James replied without rancor. But I thought we should talk, man to man, without all the government officials and lawyers present. An uncomfortable silence stretched between them before Blackwood gestured to a chair. Please sit down. Can I offer you coffee? Black, if you have it, James nodded, settling into the leather chair with the same deliberate movements he might use when approaching a skittish farm animal. He placed his notebook on the desk between them, its worn cover a stark contrast to Blackwood's gleaming glass desktop. Meredith brought the coffee, giving Blackwood a curious glance before withdrawing and closing the door. Another uncomfortable silence ensued as both men assessed each other across the desk. I've been thinking about what happened at the auction, James finally said, his voice carrying the unhurried cadence of someone accustomed to the rhythms of seasonal change rather than the frenetic pace of business. You're not the first to dismiss the concerns of an old farmer, and you won't be the last. But there's an opportunity here that might benefit us both. Blackwood raised an eyebrow skeptically. I'm listening. The Eagle Creek estate is still going to be sold, James explained, opening his notebook to a page covered with careful handwriting and simple but precise sketches of the property's water features. But whoever buys it needs to understand its complexities, not just the legal restrictions, but the practical knowledge of how the watershed functions, which fields drain first after heavy rains, where the natural springs lie, information that doesn't appear in official records. Exactly, Blackwood acknowledged, surprising himself with the admission. That's what makes properties like Eagle Creek so challenging to market properly. The legal documents don't capture the actual functioning of the land. I've spent my life observing that land. So have other farmers in this valley. We carry knowledge that no satellite mapping or soil sample can provide. James tapped his notebook with a calloused finger. I've documented seasonal changes, wildlife patterns, and water flow across 5 decades. This knowledge has value, not to stop development, but to ensure it proceeds intelligently. Blackwood studied the older man, beginning to understand what he was proposing. The pages of the notebook revealed meticulous records, water levels in key areas after storms, planting dates correlated with soil temperature, wildlife sightings that indicated ecosystem health. This wasn't sentimental attachment to the land, it was practical, data-driven knowledge accumulated through decades of direct observation. You're suggesting a partnership of some kind? A collaboration? Blackwood asked, the concept still feeling foreign on his tongue. Your company provides the market expertise, the connections to investors, James corrected, closing his notebook. But moving forward, you incorporate local knowledge and environmental stewardship into your sales approach, not as restrictions, but as value-added insights. The idea was so different from Blackwood's usual business model that his initial instinct was to dismiss it. But recent events had made it abundantly clear that his traditional approach was no longer viable in the changing regulatory environment. His business stood at a crossroads, adapt or perish. The governor mentioned something similar, Blackwood admitted, recalling the Attorney General's parting comments. He suggested my expertise could contribute to sustainable agricultural transitions. Daniel sees the bigger picture. James nodded. This isn't about punishing you or stopping progress. It's about ensuring that progress respects the land's natural systems. Blackwood found himself considering the proposal seriously. His business was at a crossroads. Continue fighting against the tide of environmental regulations and transparency requirements, or adapt and possibly discover new opportunities. The former path led to continued conflict with state agencies and a diminishing client base. The latter was uncharted territory but offered the possibility of redemption. I'd need to completely restructure my approach, he said, thinking aloud. My clients expect clean, unrestricted properties they can develop however they choose. And how's that working out for them? James asked mildly, not confrontational, but genuinely inquiring. The Westridge development that Henderson Corp built 3 years ago has flooded twice because they ignored the seasonal creek patterns. The Marshall Farm conversion to luxury homes has ongoing water quality issues because they built too close to the natural springs. Blackwood was surprised by the old farmer's detailed knowledge of recent developments. You've been paying attention. These are my neighbors, Mr. Blackwood. I may have lost my own farm, but I still care about this valley. James leaned forward, his blue eyes intent. What if your auctions included comprehensive land management plans alongside the property deeds? What if buyers received not just legal titles, but ecological understanding? As James spoke, Blackwood found himself considering the possibilities. His mind, trained to identify market opportunities, began to see potential advantages in this approach. Certain buyers, particularly those interested in sustainable agriculture, ecotourism, or conservation-minded development, might actually pay a premium for properties with well-documented ecological characteristics. There are investors entering the market who value sustainability, Blackwood acknowledged. Younger buyers especially, with different priorities than traditional developers. Exactly, James nodded. And they need someone who understands both the business side and the land itself. Someone who can bridge those worlds. The conversation continued for over 2 hours, evolving from a tentative idea to a concrete proposal. By the time James Harrison left Blackwood's office, something fundamental had shifted in the auctioneer's perspective. The land was no longer just a commodity to be sold to the highest bidder, but a complex living system with needs and patterns that any responsible owner should understand. As the door closed behind James Harrison, Meredith entered with a questioning look. "Everything all right?" "I think it might be," Blackwood replied, surprising himself with the realization. "Call the office staff together for a meeting tomorrow morning. We're going to be making some changes." That evening, Blackwood drove to the Eagle Creek estate, parking his car at the public access point and walking along the property boundary. The summer evening was mild, with golden light slanting through the trees and casting long shadows across fields that would soon need new caretakers. Birds called from the hedgerows, bobolinks and meadowlarks that depended on the grassland habitat maintained by generations of farmers. He tried to see the land as James Harrison did, not as distinct parcels with different development potentials, but as an interconnected system where water flowed along ancient pathways and wildlife moved according to patterns established over centuries. The covenant that protected the southeastern watershed now seemed less like an annoying restriction and more like essential recognition of the property's ecological function. A movement caught his eye: a fox trotting purposefully along the edge of a hayfield, probably hunting the mice that inhabited the tall grass. For decades, Blackwood had walked properties to assess their market value, but he realized now that he had never really seen them. He had cataloged attributes: road frontage, soil quality, timber value, development potential. But he had missed the living reality of the land itself, the complex web of relationships between soil, water, plants, animals, and human intervention. As twilight deepened, Blackwood made his way back to his car, his mind churning with possibilities. The partnership James Harrison proposed would require a fundamental restructuring of his business model. He would need to hire different kinds of consultants, develop new marketing approaches, and rebuild relationships with both sellers and buyers. But for the first time since the auction debacle, he felt a spark of genuine enthusiasm about his work. When he arrived home, he bypassed his usual evening scotch and instead went directly to his home office. From the shelves, he pulled down real estate manuals, auction guides, and business plans, the foundation documents of his successful career. But tonight, he set them aside and opened his laptop to research concepts that had rarely entered his professional vocabulary: ecological assessment, watershed management, sustainable development, agricultural preservation. The transformation of Blackwood Auctions began gradually over the following months. The first visible change was the consultant nameplate that appeared on the door of a small office down the hall from Blackwood's own. James Harrison accepted the part-time position with characteristic understatement, bringing with him not just his famous notebook, but decades of connections with other farmers and land managers throughout the valley. Two other retired farmers soon joined the team: Maria Vasquez, whose family had specialized in orchard management for 3 generations, and Harold Chen, whose expertise in soil conservation had helped numerous farms weather the erosion challenges of changing climate patterns. Together they formed what Blackwood somewhat awkwardly termed the Land Knowledge Division of his company, a resource that would soon prove invaluable. The next phase involved a comprehensive review of past sales, painful as it was. Blackwood hired an independent environmental law firm to assess whether other properties had been sold without proper disclosure of covenants or ecological considerations. The findings were sobering. Nearly 30% of his transactions over the past 5 years had involved some form of incomplete disclosure, though most were matters of omission rather than deliberate concealment. Rather than hiding these results, Blackwood made the controversial decision to contact the buyers directly, providing them with the complete information and offering consultation services from his new land knowledge team to address any issues that might have arisen from the undisclosed conditions. The initiative was costly, both financially and in terms of professional pride, but it established a new standard of transparency that would become a hallmark of the reformed Blackwood auctions. The most dramatic change, however, came in how properties were prepared for sale. Traditional auction listings had emphasized development potential, road frontage, and other market-oriented characteristics. The new Blackwood approach incorporated detailed environmental assessments, traditional knowledge documentation, and sustainable use recommendations. Property listings now included comprehensive land management plans alongside the usual legal documentation. Buyers received not just deeds and surveys, but ecological profiles that detailed how water moved through the property, which soil types supported which uses, and how the land functioned within the broader watershed context. Initially, some corporate clients balked at the new approach, preferring the old system that emphasized development potential while minimizing restrictions. Harold Michaels, representing Consolidated Agricultural Investments, was particularly blunt during a meeting about an upcoming farmland auction. "Vincent, what the hell is all this?" he demanded, gesturing at the thick ecological assessment that accompanied the property listing. "My investors don't want a science textbook. They want clean parcels they can develop to maximize return on investment." "Harold, Blackwood replied with newfound confidence. "What your investors actually want is to avoid the problems that plagued your last 3 acquisitions in this valley. Remember the drainage issues at the Peterson farm? The water contamination lawsuit at the West Ridge development? The collapsed road on the north section of Miller's property?" Michaels shifted uncomfortably, unable to deny these costly problems. All of those issues could have been predicted and avoided with the kind of assessment we're providing now, Blackwood continued. "This isn't environmental activism, Harold. It's risk management, and it's going to save your investors a fortune in the long run." Not all clients were convinced, and Blackwood watched with concern as several major corporate buyers took their business to competitors who maintained the old, less transparent approach. But a surprising number of investors, particularly younger, more environmentally conscious firms, were attracted to the comprehensive information now provided with each property. 6 months after the confrontation at the auction house, Blackwood found himself standing in the Eagle Creek Estate's south field with a potential buyer, not a corporate developer, but the representative of a sustainable agriculture investment group. "The covenant actually makes this property more attractive for our purposes," the investor explained as they surveyed the land. "We're looking to establish demonstration sites for regenerative farming techniques, and the water protection requirements align perfectly with our mission." Blackwood nodded, finding himself genuinely interested in the group's vision, rather than simply focused on closing the sale. "Mr. Harrison mentioned this section has particularly rich soil composition due to the seasonal flooding patterns. His notes suggest it would be ideal for certain heritage grain varieties." The investor looked surprised but pleased. "That's exactly what our agronomists recommended. How did you know?" "Let's just say I've been getting an education in actual farming, not just farm sales," Blackwood replied, thinking of the hours he'd spent with James walking these fields and listening to decades of accumulated wisdom. The most profound evidence of Blackwood's transformation came during the rescheduled auction of the Eagle Creek Estate. The event bore little resemblance to the exclusive gathering he had originally planned. Local farmers sat alongside corporate representatives. The county extension office had a booth providing information on water conservation. Most noticeably, James Harrison and 2 other senior farmers sat near the podium as official consultants, their expertise acknowledged as valuable to the proceedings. The auction room itself had been transformed as well. Where once sleek marketing displays had emphasized development potential, now detailed ecological maps showed watershed connections, soil types, and wildlife corridors. A 3-dimensional terrain model demonstrated how water moved through the property during different rainfall scenarios. Carefully documented oral histories from previous owners and neighboring farmers provided context about the land's management over time. Before beginning the bidding, Blackwood addressed the gathered crowd, feeling unusually nervous despite his decades of auction experience. This wasn't just a sale, it was the public debut of his completely restructured approach. "Welcome to the Eagle Creek Estate auction," he began, surveying the diverse audience. "Before we start, I want to acknowledge some significant changes in how we conduct these sales. Every property offered today comes with a complete environmental assessment, historical land use documentation, and clear disclosure of all legal encumbrances." He gestured toward James and the other farmers. "We're fortunate to have local experts who have generously shared their knowledge of these lands, insights that go far beyond what any title search or soil test could reveal. I encourage all potential bidders to consult with them before bidding." The auction proceeded with a different energy than Blackwood's previous events. Bidders asked thoughtful questions about sustainable land management. Corporate representatives consulted with the farmer experts about watershed dynamics. The conversation between potential buyers focused not just on price, but on stewardship plans and ecological opportunities. When the final gavel fell, the Eagle Creek Estate sold for a sum that exceeded even Blackwood's original projections, not despite the environmental covenant, but partly because of the ecological integrity it protected. The buyer, a partnership between a conservation land trust and a sustainable agriculture investment group presented not just the highest bid, but also the most comprehensive stewardship plan. After the auction, Governor Harrison made an unannounced appearance. He surveyed the transformed proceedings with approval before approaching Blackwood. "Quite a different atmosphere from our last encounter, Mr. Blackwood," he observed. Blackwood straightened his shoulders. "We've made some adjustments to our approach, Governor." "So I see." He glanced toward his brother, who was deep in conversation with the property's new owners, sketching something in his ever-present notebook. "My brother tells me you've been surprisingly receptive to his suggestions." "Your brother has forgotten more about this land than most of us will ever know," Blackwood admitted. "I was foolish to dismiss that knowledge." Governor Harrison studied him thoughtfully. "You know, when I arrived at that auction 6 months ago, I expected to shut down a business that was harming our rural communities. Instead, it appears you've created a model that might help preserve them." Coming from the governor, the observation felt like significant validation. "The credit belongs to your brother. He saw potential where I initially saw only obstacles." As the governor moved away to join his brother, Blackwood found himself approached by a young farmer he recognized from community meetings, the owner of one of the small operations downstream from Eagle Creek. "Mr. Blackwood," the young man said hesitantly, "I've been thinking about selling a portion of my property to fund equipment upgrades on the remaining acres. Would your new approach work for a smaller parcel like mine?" 6 months earlier, Blackwood would have dismissed the query as too small to be worth his time. Now he recognized something more important than the commission potential: the opportunity to facilitate a transaction that respected both the land's needs and the community's future. "I believe it would," he replied thoughtfully. "Why don't we walk your property next week? Bring your historical records, and perhaps Mr. Harrison might join us for his perspective." As the gathering dispersed, Blackwood watched James Wilson showing the new owners of Eagle Creek a particular feature of the landscape, pointing to the way water flowed across the contours of the land. Knowledge accumulated through generations of observation, Blackwood realized something fundamental had shifted within him. The validation he had once desperately sought through exclusive deals and wealthy clients now seemed hollow compared to the genuine satisfaction of facilitating transitions that honored the land and its history. Later that evening, as he sat in his home office reviewing the day's success, Blackwood's phone rang. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize. "Vincent Blackwood speaking," he answered. "Mr. Blackwood, this is Margaret Chen from Sustainable Agricultural Partners," came the response. "I attended your Eagle Creek auction today and was impressed with your approach. We have several investment clients interested in similar properties with strong ecological profiles. Are you handling other auctions in the region?" As Blackwood discussed potential properties with this new client, he noted the irony. 6 months ago, he had been desperately trying to save his business after the auction debacle. Now, because of, not despite, his partnership with James Harrison, new opportunities were emerging. Clients who valued ecological integrity were specifically seeking out Blackwood Auctions for its comprehensive approach. The conversation with Margaret Chen led to others, and gradually, a new client base began to replace those who had abandoned Blackwood after the suspended auction. These were different investors with different priorities: family foundations interested in conservation, agricultural investment groups focused on sustainable farming, even corporate clients who had come to recognize that ecological stewardship often translated to reduced liability and more stable long-term returns. As spring turned to summer, Blackwood and James Harrison continued their unlikely partnership, walking properties together throughout the valley, documenting ecological characteristics, and developing management recommendations. Their Thursday morning field sessions became a regular fixture, sometimes drawing curious observers, other real estate professionals, agricultural students, even environmental scientists interested in their collaborative approach. During one such session, as they stood on a hilltop overlooking a property scheduled for auction the following month, Blackwood asked a question that had been on his mind for some time. Why did you really come to my office that day, James? After I had you thrown out of the auction, after all that humiliation, why offer to work together?" James was quiet for a moment, watching a red-tailed hawk circle above the valley. "The soil bears witness to our deeds," he finally said. "Every action we take either honors or degrades the land beneath our feet. I could have held a grudge, could have celebrated your business failing. But what good would that do for this valley? The land doesn't care about our human disputes. It responds to how we treat it." Blackwood nodded, understanding now the deeper philosophy behind James's approach to both farming and human relationships. "Besides," James added with the hint of a smile, "Daniel told me you were too smart to let your pride get in the way of a good opportunity. Seems he was right." As they continued their survey of the property, noting spring locations and drainage patterns, Blackwood reflected on how completely his understanding of value had evolved in just 6 months. Land was not merely square footage to be bought and sold, but a living system with its own integrity and intelligence. And its true value lay not just in its market price, but in the accumulated wisdom of those who had observed and tended it through generations. What had begun as a humiliating confrontation was blossoming into an unexpected partnership that would change not just 2 men's lives, but the future of an entire valley, and perhaps, eventually, the way Americans thought about their relationship to the land itself. After much reflection, Blackwood decided to implement a radical new approach, a weighted bidding system that considered not just the financial offer, but also the proposed land use and stewardship plans. It was a gamble, one that might alienate his traditional corporate clients, but it aligned with the vision he and James had been developing. When he called to inform James of his decision, the old farmer was silent for a long moment. "That's a bold move, Vincent," he finally said. "Are you sure your business can weather such a dramatic shift?" "Honestly? No," Blackwood admitted, "but continuing the old way isn't an option anymore. Not legally, and I'm finding not morally either." Another pause. "The soil bears witness," James said softly. "What? And now, perhaps, so do we." Winter gave way to spring, and with it came the first test of the transformed Blackwood auctions, the rescheduled Eagle Creek estate sale. The event bore little resemblance to the exclusive gathering Vincent had originally planned. Local farmers sat alongside corporate representatives. The county extension office had a booth, providing information on water conservation. Most noticeably, James Harrison and 2 other senior farmers sat near the podium as official consultants, their expertise acknowledged as valuable to the proceedings. Before beginning the bidding, Blackwood addressed the gathered crowd. "Welcome to the Eagle Creek Estate Auction. Before we start, I want to acknowledge some significant changes in how we conduct these sales. Every property offered today comes with a complete environmental assessment, historical land use documentation, and clear disclosure of all legal encumbrances." He gestured toward James and the other farmers. "We're fortunate to have local experts who have generously shared their knowledge of these lands, insights that go far beyond what any title search or soil test could reveal. I encourage all potential bidders to consult with them before bidding." The auction proceeded with a different energy than Blackwood's previous events. Bidders asked thoughtful questions about sustainable land management. Corporate representatives consulted with the farmer experts about watershed dynamics. When the final gavel fell, the Eagle Creek estate sold for a sum that exceeded even Blackwood's original projections, not despite the environmental covenant, but partly because of the ecological integrity it protected. After the auction, Governor Harrison made an unannounced appearance. He surveyed the transformed proceedings with approval before approaching Blackwood. "Quite a different atmosphere from our last encounter, Mr. Blackwood," he observed. Blackwood straightened his shoulders. "We've made some adjustments to our approach, Governor." "So I see." He glanced toward his brother, who was deep in conversation with the property's new owners, sketching something in his ever-present notebook. "My brother tells me you've been surprisingly receptive to his suggestions." "Your brother has forgotten more about this land than most of us will ever know," Blackwood admitted. I was foolish to dismiss that knowledge. Governor Harrison studied him thoughtfully. You know, when I arrived at that auction 6 months ago, I expected to shut down a business that was harming our rural communities. Instead, it appears you've created a model that might help preserve them. Coming from the governor, the observation felt like significant validation. The credit belongs to your brother. He saw potential where I initially saw only obstacles. As spring blossomed into summer, the ripple effects of the transformation at Blackwood auctions began to spread throughout Oak Ridge Valley. The Harrison-Blackwood Protocol, as it was now officially known, was being implemented by other real estate firms and auction houses. Local farmers, recognizing the value of their generational knowledge, began documenting their observations more systematically. Corporate developers, initially resistant to the new approach, were discovering that ecologically informed development actually reduced long-term costs and liability. One evening, as Vincent Blackwood drove home from a community meeting where he had presented the new land transaction model, he found himself passing the site of his confrontation with James Harrison. On impulse, he pulled over at the spot where the old farmer's truck had been parked that fateful day. The sun was setting over Eagle Creek Estate, now in the early stages of transformation into a demonstration farm for regenerative agriculture. Workers were carefully restoring the watershed areas, guided by James Harrison's meticulous notes and direct supervision. As Blackwood watched, he realized how differently he now saw the land, not as abstract parcels to be bought and sold, but as a living tapestry of interconnected systems. The soil didn't just bear witness, it held the memory of countless human decisions, from the careful stewardship of indigenous people and early settlers to the short-sighted exploitation of more recent decades. His phone rang, interrupting his reflections. It was the governor's office, requesting his presence at a state agricultural policy meeting. As the liaison for the Harrison-Blackwood Protocol, Vincent Blackwood was now considered an essential voice in discussions about the future of rural land management. 6 months earlier, he had been a man concerned only with profit margins and prestigious clients. Now he was part of something larger, a movement to reconcile economic development with ecological stewardship. And it had all begun with a moment of conflict, a governor's timely intervention, and the wisdom of a weathered farmer with empty pockets, but a wealth of knowledge about the land he had tended for decades. As Blackwood started his car, he glanced once more at the Eagle Creek Estate, now bathed in the golden light of sunset. "The soil bears witness," he murmured, finally understanding the full meaning of James Harrison's words. Every action left its mark on the land, for good or ill. And now, perhaps for the first time in his career, Vincent Blackwood was conscious of the legacy he was creating with each transaction, each decision, each acre of precious land entrusted to his care. What had begun as a humiliating confrontation was blossoming into an unexpected partnership that would change not just two men's lives, but the future of an entire valley, and perhaps, eventually, the way Americans thought about their relationship to the land itself. 5 years after that fateful confrontation at the Pinecrest County Auction House, the Oak Ridge Valley Agricultural Heritage Center opened its doors on a perfect spring morning, the kind that farmers throughout the region recognized as ideal planting weather. The renovated barn that once stood at the heart of the Eagle Creek Estate now served as the centerpiece of a community institution dedicated to sustainable land management and the preservation of rural knowledge. Outside, a diverse crowd gathered for the ribbon-cutting ceremony. Local farmers in work clothes, corporate representatives in business attire, government officials, and families from throughout the county. They stood together on land that had nearly become another anonymous development, but instead had transformed into something unique. A working demonstration farm, educational center, and community gathering place. Governor Daniel Harrison, now in his second term and with a national reputation for innovative rural policy, approached the podium set up on the barn's wide porch. At 57, he carried the same commanding presence that had stopped an auction in its tracks 5 years earlier, though his salt and pepper hair now had more salt than pepper. "Welcome, everyone, "To what I believe represents the future of rural America," he began, his voice carrying across the attentive crowd. 5 years ago, this property stood at the center of a controversy about how we value land and whose knowledge counts when making decisions about its use. In the front row, 83-year-old James Harrison sat with quiet dignity, his weathered hands resting on a familiar leather notebook. Beside him, looking somewhat uncomfortable in the place of honor but present nonetheless, sat Vincent Blackwood, whose transformation had become almost as legendary as the confrontation that sparked it. "Today," the governor continued, "the Eagle Creek estate stands as a testament to what happens when we combine traditional knowledge with modern innovation, when we recognize that the highest value of land isn't always reflected in its sale price." The governor gestured toward his brother and Blackwood. "I want to acknowledge two men whose unlikely partnership made today possible. My brother, James Harrison, who stood up for the land when it needed a voice, and Vincent Blackwood, who demonstrated that true leadership often means having the courage to change course when presented with new understanding." The crowd applauded as both men nodded in acknowledgement. Their former antagonism long since transformed into a productive working relationship that had reshaped land transactions throughout the state. After Blackwood's pioneering changes to his auction practices, other auctioneers and real estate firms had initially mocked his unnecessary complications. But when buyers began specifically seeking out Blackwood auctions for their comprehensive approach to land sales, competitors had quickly followed suit. What began as one man's reluctant adaptation had evolved into a new standard for agricultural property transfers. The journey to this point had been neither straightforward nor easy. In the months following the suspended auction, Vincent Blackwood had faced significant professional and personal challenges. Several of his most lucrative corporate clients had abandoned him, unwilling to be associated with his tarnished reputation. His revenue had dropped precipitously, forcing him to downsize his office and let go of staff who had been with him for years. There were moments, alone in his study late at night, when he questioned whether his decision to partner with James Harrison had been an act of wisdom or professional suicide. What sustained him through this difficult transition was, unexpectedly, the growing relationship with the very man he had once dismissed. James Harrison, despite their troubled beginning, proved to be not only a knowledgeable consultant but a patient teacher. The elderly farmer asked nothing of Blackwood except an open mind and a willingness to walk the land with new eyes. Their Thursday morning walks became a ritual that Blackwood came to treasure. Each week, rain or shine, they would meet at a different property in the valley, and James would reveal another layer of understanding about the intricate relationships between soil, water, and human intervention. "You see that line of trees there?" James had asked during one early spring excursion, pointing to a seemingly random row of maples along a field edge. "My grandfather planted those in 1923 after 3 consecutive years of topsoil loss. They break the wind that used to scour this hillside bare. Simple solution passed down through generations." Such practical wisdom, accumulated over decades of careful observation, proved invaluable when Blackwood began restructuring his auction approach. Properties listed with his firm now included detailed histories of land management practices, seasonal patterns, and ecological interconnections. To his surprise, a new type of buyer emerged, one that valued this information as much as traditional measures like soil quality or road access. The first major test of the new approach came 8 months after the confrontation, when Blackwood auctioned the Miller Farm, a 175-acre property adjacent to Eagle Creek. Instead of his traditional focus on development potential, the auction materials emphasized the property's role in the local watershed, its historical crop rotation practices, and the indigenous knowledge incorporated into its field patterns. 3 corporate bidders withdrew immediately, uninterested in property with such clearly articulated ecological responsibilities. But 5 new bidders appeared, including a sustainable agriculture investment group, a conservation-minded wealthy family, and a cooperative of young farmers pooling their resources. The winning bid came from the cooperative, who presented not just a competitive financial offer, but a detailed stewardship plan that built upon the traditional practices documented in the property history. When the gavel fell, something extraordinary happened. The assembled crowd applauded not just the sale, but the promise of continuity in the land's care. "I've never seen anything like it," Blackwood had confessed to James afterward. "People were celebrating a vision, not just a transaction." James had smiled, the lines around his eyes deepening. The soil bears witness to how we treat it. Perhaps now people are beginning to bear witness too. That initial success led to others, and gradually the Harrison-Blackwood approach gained traction beyond individual sales. Local banks began incorporating ecological assessment into their agricultural lending criteria. County zoning boards started requesting traditional knowledge documentation for development applications. The State Agricultural Extension Office launched a program to record and preserve generational farming practices, with James Harrison serving as its first consulting expert. Governor Harrison, recognizing the potential of his brother's collaboration with Blackwood, convened a rural land policy task force to explore how these principles might be formalized into state guidelines. The resulting document, integrating traditional knowledge and ecological assessment in agricultural land transfers, became the foundation for what would eventually be known as the Harrison-Blackwood Protocol. Not everyone embraced these changes, of course. A coalition of development companies and industrial agricultural corporations lobbied against the new regulations, arguing that they imposed unnecessary burdens on land transactions and restricted property rights. Several lawsuits were filed challenging the legal standing of traditional knowledge in property valuation. The watershed moment came during legislative hearings on the proposed guidelines, when James Harrison testified before the State Agricultural Committee. At 81, he moved slowly to the witness table, his worn notebook in hand, facing a panel that included several skeptical legislators with ties to development interests. "Mr. Harrison," began Senator Roberts, a known advocate for unrestricted land development, "you've been presented as some kind of expert on traditional agricultural knowledge. Can you explain what qualifies you to advise on matters that affect billions of dollars in property values and development potential?" James had opened his notebook calmly, the same one he had brought to the auction 5 years earlier. "Senator, in this book are 57 years of daily observations about the land in Oak Ridge Valley. Not theories or opinions, but documented facts about how water moves through our soil, how wildlife patterns affect crop success, how weather changes impact erosion. This is not my knowledge alone. It incorporates what my father taught me and what his father taught him." He turned a weathered page. "For instance, on March 18, 1983, I recorded how the Marshall Creek watershed responded to the heaviest rainfall in 30 years. That information helped prevent flooding on 5 downstream farms. No satellite imagery or computer model had that data, only the continuous observation of people who lived with the land." As James continued, even the most skeptical committee members leaned forward, drawn in by the practical wisdom embedded in his testimony. By the end of the hearing, the fundamental premise of the Harrison-Blackwood approach had been effectively validated. Traditional knowledge, systematically documented and integrated with modern science, was not a sentimental attachment to the past, but a vital resource for sustainable land management. The final policy framework, adopted with bipartisan support, established new standards for agricultural land transactions that balanced economic interests with ecological responsibility and community heritage. The Harrison-Blackwood Protocol, as it was officially named, would go on to influence rural land policy far beyond New Hampshire's borders. The Oak Ridge Valley Agricultural Heritage Center represents more than just the preservation of this historic property, Governor Harrison continued in his dedication speech. It embodies a new approach to land stewardship that recognizes the value of generational knowledge and the importance of maintaining ecological integrity alongside economic development. The center had become a hub for the community in ways no one had initially imagined. Local schools brought students for hands-on agricultural education. Farmers from across the state came to learn about sustainable practices. Researchers used the demonstration fields to test climate-adaptive crop varieties. Even the corporate agricultural firms that had once viewed environmental considerations as mere obstacles now sent representatives to learn techniques that could reduce costs while improving land quality. Behind the scenes, the center represented an extraordinary evolution in Vincent Blackwood's professional life. The man who had once specialized in converting farmland to development property now directed the center's Land Transfer Innovation Program, training a new generation of real estate professionals in the principles of ecologically informed property transactions. His transformation had not been without personal cost. Some of his former colleagues still regarded him as a traitor to their profession, and he had weathered a painful divorce when his wife, uncomfortable with his reduced income and changing social circle, had left for Connecticut with their youngest son. But Blackwood had found unexpected fulfillment in his new role, and a community that valued his expertise in new ways. "I lost clients but found purpose," he often told the young professionals he mentored, and in the end, that made all the difference. For James Harrison, the center represented a different kind of vindication. The knowledge he had accumulated over decades, once dismissed as irrelevant by those focused solely on development potential, now informed every aspect of how the property was managed. Students came from universities across the country to study his notebook entries, now digitized and integrated with contemporary ecological research. More importantly, the center had become a gathering place for both traditional farmers and innovative agricultural entrepreneurs, bridging divides that had once seemed insurmountable. Fourth-generation farmers shared planting techniques with tech developers working on soil monitoring systems. Indigenous land management practices were studied alongside cutting-edge carbon sequestration methods. After the ribbon-cutting ceremony, as attendees explored the newly opened center, James Harrison found a quiet moment with his brother near the small pond that had featured in their old family photographs. "Margaret would have loved this," he said softly, gazing across the carefully maintained wetlands that now served as both wildlife habitat and natural water filtration for the surrounding farms. His late wife had been gone for 15 years, but her passion for the land remained alive in the projects James now pursued. Governor Harrison smiled, linking his arm through his brother's. "She always said you were stubborn enough for both of you." Turns out she was right. "Wasn't stubbornness," James corrected gently. "Just knew the land deserved better than to be carved up without consideration for how it all works together." "Well, that stubbornness has changed how we approach rural development across the state," his brother replied. "The Harrison-Blackwood Protocol is being adopted in 3 neighboring states." The Harrison-Blackwood Protocol, as it had come to be known in policy circles, established standards for agricultural land sales that included comprehensive environmental assessment, documentation of traditional knowledge, and transparent disclosure of all ecological implications. What had begun as a confrontation in an auction house had evolved into a framework for balancing development with preservation. Across the gathering, Vincent Blackwood was engaged in conversation with several young farmers eager to discuss the upcoming sale of adjoining properties. At 60, Blackwood had transformed not just his business practices, but his entire approach to his role in the community. Where once he had viewed local farmers as obstacles to profitable transactions, he now saw them as essential partners in sustainable land management. The key, he was explaining to the group, is understanding that the value of agricultural land isn't just in its development potential. It's in the accumulated knowledge of how that specific piece of earth functions within the larger ecosystem. One of the young farmers gestured toward James Harrison. "Mr. Harrison has been helping us map the seasonal water patterns on our family's property. Some of those observations go back to my grandfather's time." Blackwood nodded appreciatively. That kind of generational knowledge is invaluable. When we include it in property listings, buyers recognize they're getting more than just acres. They're getting wisdom that can prevent costly mistakes. This approach had not just reformed land sales, it had begun healing the deep divisions between longtime agricultural families and more recent investors by creating a framework that valued local knowledge and environmental stewardship. The Harrison-Blackwood Protocol had established common ground between groups that had once viewed each other with suspicion and resentment. The success of the approach had drawn attention far beyond New Hampshire. Agricultural policy experts from universities nationwide came to study the Oak Ridge Valley model. A documentary film team spent 6 months following James and Blackwood as they worked with farmers and developers to implement their collaborative approach to land management. The resulting film, The Soil's Memory, won awards at several environmental film festivals and was screened at the Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C. Perhaps most significantly, the financial results had begun to speak for themselves. Properties sold under the Harrison-Blackwood Protocol showed reduced environmental remediation costs, fewer legal disputes over water rights and access issues, and more stable long-term valuations. Insurance companies began offering preferential rates for properties with comprehensive ecological assessment and management plans, recognizing that such properties represented lower liability risks. Later that afternoon, as the celebration continued, Blackwood found himself approached by a corporate representative he recognized from the original Eagle Creek auction, one of the bidders who had been prepared to develop the property without regard for the watershed covenant. "Quite a change from 5 years ago," the man observed, gesturing toward the thriving demonstration farm that now occupied the land he had once hoped to purchase. Blackwood nodded. "I'd say for the better, wouldn't you?" "Surprisingly, yes." The representative looked thoughtful. "My firm was initially frustrated when the original auction was halted, but watching how this property has been managed since then has actually influenced our approach to other agricultural investments. Turns out respecting the land's natural systems is good business." "Something Mr. Harrison tried to tell us that day," Blackwood acknowledged. "We just weren't ready to listen." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a university research team requesting permission to tour the center's innovative water management systems. Blackwood excused himself, but the encounter left him reflecting on how completely perspectives had shifted in 5 years. Not just his own, but those of the very corporate interests that had once epitomized the extractive approach to land development. As the day drew to a close, Governor Harrison gathered the key stakeholders for a photograph in front of the renovated barn. James Harrison and other local farmers, Vincent Blackwood and representatives from his reformed auction house, the Sustainable Investment Group that had purchased the property, and researchers from the Agricultural Extension Service. They stood together, this unlikely alliance that had transformed not just a single property, but an entire approach to rural land management. James Harrison stood at the center of the group, his presence a living connection to the agricultural traditions they were working to preserve. Beside him, Vincent Blackwood represented how confrontation could lead to transformation rather than merely creating winners and losers. 5 years ago, we stood as adversaries in an auction house, James remarked quietly to Blackwood as they posed for the photograph. "Now look at us," Blackwood smiled, acknowledging the profound journey they had taken together. "Best mistake I ever made, throwing you out of that auction." The photograph captured a moment of genuine collaboration among groups that had once been at odds. A visual representation of what was possible when financial interests and environmental stewardship were seen as complementary rather than competing values. As the crowd dispersed and the sun began to set over Oak Ridge Valley, James Harrison walked slowly through fields he had known since childhood. Though he no longer owned this land, his connection to it ran deeper than any property deed could reflect. His knowledge, once dismissed as irrelevant by those who saw only development potential, now informed every aspect of how the property was managed. Governor Harrison found his brother standing near the old oak tree that had been a landmark for generations of farmers. "Ready to head home, Jim? It's been a long day." James nodded, but his gaze remained on the gently rolling fields, now illuminated by the golden light of sunset. "You know, when Blackwood had me escorted out of that auction, I never imagined it would lead to all this. I just wanted them to know about the watershed covenant." "Sometimes the smallest actions have the largest consequences," his brother observed. "Your stand that day changed how we think about land in this state." As they walked toward the parking area, they passed Vincent Blackwood, who was preparing to leave as well. The two men, once adversaries, now unlikely allies, exchanged a look of mutual respect that needed no words to convey its meaning. "Mr. Harrison," Blackwood said, extending his hand. "Another successful day for Oak Ridge Valley." James shook the offered hand firmly. "Indeed, though I think we're just getting started." The simple exchange represented something profound, not just a personal reconciliation, but a template for how rural communities might navigate the complex challenges of preserving agricultural heritage while embracing necessary change. As James and Governor Harrison drove away from the Heritage Center, they passed the spot where the state trooper motorcade had come to a stop 5 years earlier, the moment when a governor's authority had intervened to protect a farmer's knowledge. That dramatic confrontation had yielded not to continued conflict, but to collaboration and innovation that benefited the entire community. "The soil bears witness," James murmured, echoing words he had spoken during that fateful auction. His brother smiled, understanding the deeper meaning in his simple phrase. "And thanks to you, so will future generations." Behind them, the Agricultural Heritage Center stood as a monument not to any individual, but to the principle that had guided James Harrison throughout his life. The understanding that land was not merely a commodity to be bought and sold, but a living system that required respect and stewardship. The center's mission statement, displayed prominently at its entrance, expressed this philosophy in words drawn directly from James's weathered notebook. "The soil bears witness to our deeds. Our task is to ensure those memories are of stewardship rather than exploitation, of wisdom rather than expedience, of care that spans generations rather than profit measured in quarters." These words, once dismissed as the sentimental musings of a weathered farmer with empty pockets, now guided land management decisions throughout the region, a testament to how quickly transformation could occur when confrontation led to understanding rather than merely establishing winners and losers. And it had all begun with a moment of humiliation in an auction house, a governor's convoy, and the courage of people on both sides to grow beyond their initial positions toward something wiser and more enduring than either could have created alone. But for Vincent Blackwood, the journey of transformation was just beginning. As he drove home that evening, he reflected on the 5 years that had passed since that confrontation. Years that had changed him in ways he never could have anticipated. The man who had once viewed land purely as a commodity now saw himself as its steward and advocate. What new challenges and opportunities might the next 5 years bring? How far could the Harrison-Blackwood Protocol spread beyond Oak Ridge Valley? And could two unlikely allies continue to bridge the divide between economic development and environmental preservation in an increasingly polarized world? The answers to these questions remain to be written, not just in policy documents and land management plans, but in the soil itself, the ultimate witness to humanity's evolving relationship with the earth that sustained it. 15 years after that momentous day at the Pinecrest County Auction House, the National Rural Heritage Conference hummed with energy as representatives from agricultural communities across America gathered to exchange ideas about sustainable land management and preservation of farming traditions. The grand ballroom of the Washington, D.C. Conference Center was filled to capacity for the keynote address, a presentation on the transformative impact of what was now widely known as the Harrison-Blackwood model. At the podium stood Dr. Elena Chen, director of the Rural Sustainability Institute, and one of the country's leading experts on agricultural policy. Behind her, a large screen displayed the now iconic photograph taken 10 years earlier at the opening of the Oak Ridge Valley Agricultural Heritage Center. James Harrison and Vincent Blackwood standing side by side, their unlikely alliance having sparked a movement that had spread far beyond their small New Hampshire community. 15 years ago, Dr. Chen began, an elderly farmer was escorted out of an auction house for attempting to share information about a watershed covenant on land being sold for development. That seemingly small moment of conflict has resulted in what many now recognize as the most significant reform in agricultural land management policy of the past half-century. In the front row sat Daniel Harrison, now 72 and recently retired after serving 2 terms as governor and later as U.S. Secretary of Agriculture. Beside him sat Vincent Blackwood, now in his 70s but still actively involved in the rural land stewardship programs he had helped establish. James Harrison was no longer with them, having passed away peacefully 3 years earlier at the age of 95, but his presence was felt throughout the conference that had dedicated its proceedings to his memory. The journey from local conflict to national movement had not been straightforward or without opposition. In the decade following the establishment of the Oak Ridge Valley Agricultural Heritage Center, the Harrison-Blackwood model had faced significant challenges from both corporate agricultural interests and traditional property rights advocates. Several lawsuits had attempted to block the implementation of protocols requiring ecological assessment and traditional knowledge documentation in land transactions, arguing that such requirements constituted regulatory overreach and diminished property values. The turning point had come 8 years after the original confrontation, when severe flooding devastated agricultural communities across the Midwest. Communities that had embraced conventional development without consideration for watershed dynamics or historical land management practices. In stark contrast, regions that had implemented the Harrison-Blackwood protocols experienced significantly less damage, their water management systems functioning largely as designed, their fields protected by strategically maintained natural buffers. The economic impact was undeniable. A study by the National Agricultural Economics Institute calculated that for every dollar invested in comprehensive land assessment and traditional knowledge integration, communities saved an average of $7 in disaster recovery costs. Insurance companies, initially skeptical of the new approach, became its most powerful advocates, offering substantial premium reductions for properties managed under Harrison-Blackwood principles. Corporate resistance began to crumble in the face of these financial realities. What had started as an idealistic vision of reconciling environmental stewardship with economic development was proving to be sound business practice. Firms that had once led the opposition to the new protocols now sent representatives to Oak Ridge Valley to study their implementation, and gradually, the approach that had begun in a moment of conflict evolved into a mainstream framework for rural land management nationwide. The Harrison-Blackwood model began as a local response to a specific conflict, Dr. Chen continued, but its principles have proven remarkably adaptable across diverse agricultural contexts. Today, 28 states have adopted some version of the integrated assessment protocols that began in Oak Ridge Valley, and federal agencies now incorporate traditional knowledge documentation in all agricultural land transactions involving government funding. The transformation that had begun with one confrontation at a rural auction house had gradually expanded into a comprehensive approach to land management that bridged divides between environmental concerns, economic interests, and cultural preservation. What Vincent Blackwood had initially viewed as an unwelcome complication to his business model had evolved into a framework that created value for all stakeholders in the agricultural ecosystem. For Vincent Blackwood, the 15 years since that fateful auction had brought profound personal and professional transformation. After the initial success of the reformed Blackwood auctions, he had gradually shifted his focus from individual property sales to policy development and implementation. At 65, he had sold his auction business to a cooperative of younger professionals committed to the Harrison-Blackwood principles and founded the Land Stewardship Institute, a think tank dedicated to advancing innovative approaches to rural property transactions. The transition had not been without personal cost. His marriage had ended during the turbulent early years of his partnership with James Harrison. His wife, unable to adjust to their reduced circumstances and changing social circle. His eldest son, who had been groomed to take over the family business, had moved to Chicago to pursue a career in commercial real estate, disillusioned with his father's new direction. For several years, Blackwood had lived alone in a modest apartment above his office, pouring his energy into developing the protocols that would eventually bear his name. The healing had come gradually, through unexpected channels. His youngest daughter, Rebecca, who had been away at college during the initial confrontation, returned to Oak Ridge Valley after completing a degree in environmental science. Initially skeptical of her father's transformation, she had eventually become his strongest ally, bringing contemporary ecological expertise to complement the traditional knowledge that James Harrison had contributed to their work. More surprising was the reconciliation with his middle son, Michael, who had returned to New Hampshire after a decade working in corporate agriculture in California. Disillusioned by the ecological damage he'd witnessed in industrial farming operations, Michael had reached out to his father seeking a different path. Their cautious reconnection had evolved into a productive professional partnership, with Michael eventually taking leadership of the Blackwood Sustainable Land Services branch, focusing on agricultural property transitions. These personal healings had paralleled the broader community reconciliation that the Harrison-Blackwood model facilitated. Throughout rural America, regions that implemented the protocols reported not just environmental and economic benefits, but social ones as well. Reduced conflict between developers and conservation interests, increased cooperation between multi-generational farming families and new agricultural entrepreneurs, and strengthened connections between rural communities and the urban markets they served. Perhaps most significantly, Dr. Chen noted in her keynote address, "We've seen a 42% reduction in water rights litigation in regions that have fully implemented the model, along with measurable improvements in soil health and watershed integrity. When we honor the knowledge of those who have worked the land for generations, we make better decisions about its future." After the keynote address, the conference broke into specialized sessions, with Vincent Blackwood leading a workshop on reforming auction and real estate practices to better serve both sellers and the land itself. The man who had once mockingly dismissed a weathered farmer with empty pockets now championed the integration of ecological understanding into every aspect of property transactions. The workshop space was filled beyond capacity, with young real estate professionals and established agents alike eager to learn from the man whose name had become synonymous with sustainable land transitions. As Blackwood looked out over the crowd, he marveled at how completely the landscape had shifted in 15 years. From a world where environmental considerations were seen as obstacles to profitable transactions, to one where ecological integrity had become a central component of property value. The key insight, Blackwood explained to his packed session, is recognizing that land carries multiple forms of value: economic, ecological, cultural, and historical. When we acknowledge all these dimensions in our transactions, we create outcomes that benefit both buyers and the broader community. His workshop wasn't just theoretical. Throughout the presentation, Blackwood shared case studies of actual property sales conducted under Harrison-Blackwood protocols. Farms that had been saved from subdivision, watersheds that had been preserved while still allowing productive use, historic properties that had found new purpose while maintaining their ecological functions. Each example demonstrated how comprehensive assessment and transparency had created not just better environmental outcomes, but more stable property values and reduced long-term liability for buyers. 15 years ago, he admitted to the attentive audience, I viewed James Harrison as an obstacle to a profitable auction. I had him removed from the room because his information about watershed covenants threatened to reduce the sale price of Eagle Creek Estate. What I didn't understand then was that ignoring those ecological realities wouldn't make them disappear. It would simply transfer the costs to future owners, to the surrounding community, and ultimately to the land itself. A young real estate agent raised her hand. But doesn't all this ecological assessment and traditional knowledge documentation add significant costs to property transactions? How do you justify that to clients who just want the highest price or the quickest sale? It was a question Blackwood had once asked himself, and his answer reflected 15 years of evolved thinking. What we've found is that transparency about ecological functions doesn't reduce property value. It reallocates it. A parcel that can't support certain types of development due to watershed considerations might command a premium price for sustainable agriculture precisely because of those water characteristics. The key is matching properties with buyers who value their specific attributes, rather than treating all land as generic commodity. His approach had not just reformed his own business, but had spawned an entirely new professional certification. Land Stewardship Advisors, specialists who bridge the gap between traditional real estate services and environmental consulting. Young professionals from both rural and urban backgrounds were now pursuing careers that combined financial expertise with ecological understanding. Many of them inspired by the story of how Blackwood's confrontation with James Harrison had led to his own profound transformation. Across the conference center, in another packed session, Daniel Harrison participated in a panel discussion on integrating agricultural heritage into economic development strategies. Though no longer in public office, his influence on rural policy remained substantial through his foundation work and advisory roles. The panel included economists, cultural heritage specialists, and agricultural policy experts. But the audience questions repeatedly returned to the practical implementation of the Harrison-Blackwood model. How could communities with limited resources conduct the kind of comprehensive land assessment the protocol required? How could traditional knowledge be documented in regions where farming practices hadn't been systematically recorded? How could the economic value of ecological services be quantified in ways that financial institutions would recognize? The real lesson from Oak Ridge Valley, Daniel told the audience in response to these practical concerns, wasn't just about protecting one piece of land or one water covenant. It was about recognizing that the knowledge held by long-term stewards of the land represents intellectual capital that deserves both respect and compensation. This principle had manifested in the creation of a radical new approach to property valuation, one that factored in knowledge equity alongside traditional measures of land value. Farmers who had documented generations of observations about their land could now monetize this intellectual property when transitioning their operations, creating financial recognition for wisdom that had previously been dismissed as merely anecdotal. My brother didn't just know facts about Eagle Creek Estate, Daniel explained. He understood how the entire valley functioned as an interconnected system, which fields drained into which streams, how the watershed responded to different rainfall patterns, which soil types supported which crops. That knowledge had been accumulated over decades of careful observation, passed down through generations, and refined through practical experience. In any other context, we would recognize that as valuable intellectual property. The Harrison-Blackwood model simply extends that recognition to agricultural knowledge. The panel discussion continued, exploring how different regions had adapted the core principles of the Harrison-Blackwood model to their specific agricultural contexts, from the rice farms of Louisiana to the citrus groves of Florida, from the wheat fields of Kansas to the vineyards of California. Each implementation looked different in its details, but shared the fundamental commitment to integrating traditional knowledge with contemporary science, to balancing economic productivity with ecological integrity, and to recognizing the interconnected nature of rural landscapes. During the conference luncheon, Daniel found himself seated with a group of young farmers from diverse backgrounds, all participants in the James Harrison Fellowship Program that provided training in both traditional agricultural knowledge and modern sustainable techniques. The fellowship program had been established 5 years earlier, funded initially by a coalition of family foundations committed to rural revitalization. Its mission was elegantly simple: to connect young people interested in agricultural careers with the generational knowledge of experienced farmers, while simultaneously providing them with scientific training in contemporary sustainable practices. Fellows spent 2 years in intensive study, dividing their time between classroom learning at partner universities and hands-on apprenticeships with master farmers in their regions. My grandfather's farm was being sold for development when he heard about the Harrison-Blackwood approach, explained one young woman from Georgia. The comprehensive assessment revealed unique soil characteristics that made the property far more valuable for specialized crop production than for housing. Now I'm operating a successful organic farm on land that almost became another subdivision. Similar stories echoed around the table: tales of farms saved, watersheds protected, and rural heritage preserved through the application of principles that had emerged from that fateful confrontation 15 years earlier. A young man from Michigan described how his community had used the Harrison-Blackwood protocols to resolve a decades-long conflict between agricultural interests and a local indigenous tribe over water rights. By documenting both the farmers' historical usage patterns and the tribe's traditional ecological knowledge, they had developed a cooperative watershed management plan that served both communities' needs while improving overall ecological health. A woman from Arizona explained how her family's ranch had implemented the Harrison-Blackwood assessment process and discovered that their land had unique potential for carbon sequestration, a finding that had opened new revenue streams through carbon offset programs while improving their grazing practices. Each story represented a unique application of the core principles that James Harrison and Vincent Blackwood had developed. That land held multiple forms of value beyond its market price. That generational knowledge deserved respect and compensation. And that transparency about ecological functions created better outcomes for both buyers and communities. As lunch concluded, Daniel found himself reflecting on how his brother would have responded to this gathering. James had never sought recognition or acclaim for his knowledge. He had simply wanted the land to be respected and understood. Yet the movement that bore his name was transforming rural communities across the nation, creating economic opportunity while preserving ecological integrity, bridging divides that had once seemed insurmountable. The afternoon sessions included a presentation on the digital tools that had evolved to support the Harrison-Blackwood model, sophisticated mapping applications that integrated historical land use data with current ecological assessments, platforms for documenting and sharing traditional agricultural knowledge while protecting intellectual property rights, and transaction frameworks that incorporated ecological services into property valuation. What had begun as James Harrison's weathered notebook had evolved into a comprehensive digital infrastructure supporting sustainable land management nationwide. As the conference continued into its second day, attendees toured the newly established National Agricultural Knowledge Repository, a digital and physical archive that documented traditional farming practices, ecosystem observations, and land management techniques from rural communities across America. The repository had been 10 years in the making, starting as a modest collection of digitized farm journals and oral histories housed at the Oak Ridge Valley Agricultural Heritage Center. As the Harrison-Blackwood model gained national recognition, agricultural communities across the country began contributing their own documented knowledge, creating a richly detailed mosaic of place-based farming wisdom. The Federal Department of Agriculture had eventually recognized the value of this grassroots effort, providing funding for a permanent home in Washington and professional archival support. The repository's central hall featured a life-sized bronze statue of James Harrison, depicted sitting on a fence with his notebook open, eternally recording his observations of the land he loved. Vincent Blackwood paused before the statue, reflecting on the journey that had brought him to this moment. The man he had once dismissed as irrelevant had left a legacy that would influence agricultural practices for generations to come. "He would have been embarrassed by all this attention," Daniel Harrison commented, joining Blackwood beside his brother's likeness. Blackwood nodded in agreement. He never wanted recognition. He just wanted the land to be respected. "And now it is," Daniel replied, in ways none of us could have imagined that day at the auction house. They stood in companionable silence, these once adversaries whose conflict had yielded not to bitterness, but to a productive partnership that had transformed not just their own lives, but the lives of countless others across rural America. The repository's digital archives contained thousands of detailed land observations spanning more than a century. Weather patterns, soil conditions, planting dates, harvest yields, wildlife migrations, water flows. Some came from carefully preserved farm journals like James Harrison's, others from oral histories recorded with aging farmers before their knowledge could be lost. Together, they formed a priceless record of humanity's relationship with the land, documenting both successful stewardship and failed exploitation. "You know what amazes me most about all this?" Blackwood said, gesturing toward the bustling repository floor where researchers and farmers consulted historical records alongside contemporary ecological data. "We always had this knowledge. It was there in notebooks like James's, in the memories of farmers who'd worked the same land for generations. But we treated it as worthless, sentimental, unscientific, irrelevant to the real business of land transactions." Daniel nodded thoughtfully. The Harrison-Blackwood model didn't create new information. It simply recognized the value of what had always been there. "And that recognition changed everything," Blackwood replied. "Once we started listening to the land and to those who knew it best, we discovered solutions to problems we didn't even know we had." This fundamental shift in perspective had rippled through multiple sectors of the economy. Insurance companies now required Harrison-Blackwood assessments before issuing policies on agricultural properties, recognizing that such evaluations dramatically reduced risk exposure. Banks offered preferential rates for land purchases that incorporated traditional knowledge documentation and ecological covenant commitments. Even corporate agricultural interests, initially the most resistant to the new approach, had gradually begun incorporating its principles into their land management strategies, finding that ecological integrity often translated to improved long-term productivity and reduced input costs. Later that evening at the conference's formal dinner, Vincent Blackwood received the inaugural James Harrison Stewardship Award for his role in developing and promoting sustainable land transaction practices. As he accepted the honor, he reflected on the irony of receiving an award named for a man he had once had removed from his auction. "James Harrison taught me the most valuable lesson of my career," Blackwood told the assembled guests. "He showed me that the true value of land cannot be measured solely in dollars per acre. Its worth lies in the complex web of relationships, ecological, cultural, and economic, that sustain both the land itself and the communities that depend upon it." He held up the award, a small bronze replica of James's weathered notebook. "I accept this honor with humility, knowing that my greatest contribution was simply having the wisdom to listen when a farmer tried to teach an auctioneer about what really matters." The applause that followed reflected not just appreciation for Blackwood's remarks, but recognition of the broader principle they embodied: that transformation often begins with conflict, but can lead to collaboration when people remain open to growth and learning. The keynote speaker for the evening was Dr. Robert Chen of the National Agricultural Economics Institute, whose longitudinal study of Harrison-Blackwood implementation had documented its economic impacts across diverse regions. When we began this research project 10 years ago, Dr. Chen explained, critics of the Harrison-Blackwood model argued that its ecological assessment requirements and traditional knowledge documentation would increase transaction costs and depress rural land values. What we found is precisely the opposite. He clicked to a slide showing comparative data from counties that had fully implemented the protocols versus those that had maintained conventional land transaction practices. Properties sold under Harrison-Blackwood protocols have shown 23% lower litigation rates, 31% reduced environmental remediation costs, and, most surprisingly, 17% higher average property values over the 15-year study period. These economic benefits derive directly from the improved information flow and reduced uncertainty that comprehensive assessment provides. When buyers know exactly what they're purchasing, both the opportunities and constraints inherent in a particular property, they make better decisions and place appropriate value on the land's actual characteristics. The data confirmed what practitioners had observed anecdotally. That transparency about ecological functions and integration of traditional knowledge didn't diminish property values, but rather directed properties toward their highest and best uses. Uses that respected the land's natural systems while creating sustainable economic returns. After the dinner concluded, Daniel Harrison invited Blackwood to join him on the conference center's terrace, which offered a sweeping view of the capital city. As they looked out over the illuminated monuments, he handed Blackwood a small package wrapped in simple brown paper. "I found this while going through Jim's things," he explained. "I think he would have wanted you to have it." Blackwood carefully unwrapped the package to reveal James Harrison's leather notebook, the same one he had clutched during that confrontation 15 years earlier. The pages were filled with meticulous observations about the land, weather patterns, and wildlife, alongside philosophical reflections about stewardship and responsibility. "I can't accept this," Blackwood said, deeply moved by the gesture. "This belongs in the repository with his other papers." Daniel shook his head. "The repository has his other notebooks, but this one, the one he had with him that day, I think he would want it to remind you of how far you've both come." Blackwood carefully opened the worn cover, noticing for the first time an inscription on the inside page, a quote James had written decades earlier. "The measure of our lives is not what we accumulate, but what we preserve for those who follow." "He was writing a book, you know," Daniel said quietly. "In those last few years, he finished it just before he passed. The Soil Bears Witness, a farmer's philosophy of stewardship. It's being published next month." "I'll be first in line to buy it," Blackwood replied, still carefully holding the notebook that represented both his greatest professional misstep and the beginning of his most meaningful work. The final day of the conference began with a session on international adaptations of the Harrison-Blackwood model. Representatives from agricultural communities in Europe, Africa, and Asia shared how they had modified the core principles to fit their specific cultural and ecological contexts. A cooperative of rice farmers from Thailand described integrating traditional water management techniques documented over centuries with contemporary climate adaptation strategies. Indigenous land managers from Kenya presented their work combining ancestral grazing rotation practices with modern satellite monitoring to restore degraded rangelands. What had begun as a local conflict in a small New Hampshire auction house had evolved into a global movement for reconciling traditional wisdom with contemporary science, economic development with ecological integrity. As they returned to the conference, they passed an exhibit showcasing the impact of the Harrison-Blackwood model across diverse agricultural communities. Photographs of restored watersheds, thriving family farms, and collaborative land management projects that bridge traditional divides between environmental and economic interests. One display particularly caught their attention: a map showing the spread of the model from Oak Ridge Valley outward, like ripples expanding across a pond. What had begun as a local conflict had eventually influenced land management practices in communities across the country and was now being adapted for international applications. "Did you ever imagine it would go this far?" Daniel asked, studying the map. Blackwood shook his head. "I was just trying to save my business after your brother and your convoy upended my auction. But somewhere along the way, I discovered there was more satisfaction in doing things right than in doing them profitably." Though it turns out, Daniel observed, that doing things right eventually became profitable too. It was true. Blackwood's reformed auction house had not just survived the transition, but had thrived, becoming the industry leader in sustainable land transactions. His willingness to integrate ecological understanding and traditional knowledge into property sales had positioned his firm at the forefront of a significant shift in how agricultural land was valued and transferred. The conference concluded the following day with a ceremonial planting of heritage apple trees on the grounds of the Department of Agriculture. Saplings propagated from stock grown at the Oak Ridge Valley Agricultural Heritage Center, which had become a national model for integrated farming and education facilities. As participants gathered for the planting, Dr. Chen invited Daniel Harrison to share a few closing thoughts. 15 years ago, Daniel began, his voice carrying across the attentive crowd, my brother stood in an auction house trying to protect a covenant that preserved a watershed. He wasn't fighting for his own land. That had been sold years before. He was standing up for principles that transcended property ownership. He gestured toward the young trees waiting to be planted. These saplings carry genetic material that my brother preserved on our family farm decades ago, varieties that might otherwise have been lost. Like the principles he defended, they represent a living connection between past and future, a reminder that our role is not to consume resources, but to steward them for generations yet to come. As he spoke, Vincent Blackwood found himself thinking about how completely his understanding of value had transformed since that confrontation. The man who had once measured success in commission percentages and sale prices now found deeper satisfaction in transactions that honored both the land itself and the knowledge of those who tended it. When the ceremonial planting was complete, the conference participants gathered for a final photograph. Representatives from farming communities across the nation standing together beneath a banner that read, "The Soil Bears Witness, Honoring the Harrison Blackwood Legacy." The phrase had become shorthand for an approach that valued agricultural heritage not as nostalgia, but as vital knowledge essential for sustainable future development. And it had all begun with an elderly farmer being escorted from an auction house and a governor's convoy arriving just in time to transform humiliation into opportunity. As Blackwood prepared to return to Oak Ridge Valley the next morning, he took one last look at James Harrison's notebook, running his fingers over the worn leather cover that had witnessed so much. Inside were not just observations about soil and water, but a philosophy that had changed countless lives, including his own. "The soil bears witness," Blackwood murmured, echoing James's words from that first confrontation. "And thanks to you, James, so do we." The notebook would occupy a place of honor in Blackwood's office, a daily reminder that the most profound transformations often begin with moments of conflict, and that wisdom sometimes comes from those we are initially most inclined to dismiss. The elderly farmer with empty pockets had indeed been weathered after decades of working the land, but his spirit and wisdom remained vibrant, continuing to influence how Americans thought about their relationship to the earth, long after that dramatic day when a governor's convoy had shut down an auction and started a movement. Back in Oak Ridge Valley, the legacy of James Harrison and Vincent Blackwood's unlikely partnership was visible everywhere. In the thriving Agricultural Heritage Center, in the reformed land transaction practices that now dominated the market, and, most importantly, in the preserved watersheds and sustainable farms that characterized the region. Young farmers were returning to the valley, drawn by the innovative approaches to land stewardship and the supportive community that had developed around the Harrison Blackwood model. Corporate agricultural interests, once viewed with suspicion, now collaborated with local farmers on regenerative practices that benefited both the land and the bottom line. The confrontation that might have ended with bitterness and division had instead sparked a revolution in how Americans valued and transferred rural land. And at the center of it all was a simple insight, first articulated by a weathered farmer with empty pockets, but a wealth of wisdom. The soil bears witness to our deeds, recording in its complex systems the choices we make about stewardship and exploitation, about short-term gain versus long-term sustainability. The land remembered, even when people tried to forget. And now, thanks to James Harrison and Vincent Blackwood's unexpected alliance, so would future generations of Americans who inherited both the land and the responsibility to care for it wisely. As Vincent Blackwood drove through the valley toward home, the late afternoon sun illuminating the patchwork of farms and forests that had nearly been lost to unthinking development, he felt a profound sense of gratitude for the man who had confronted him that day in the auction house. The humiliation he had felt when the governor's convoy arrived had given way to something far more valuable: the opportunity to participate in healing humanity's relationship with the land that sustained it. The soil bore witness to their deeds, recording both past mistakes and present efforts at restoration. And in the ledger of the land, Vincent Blackwood was no longer an exploiter, but a steward, helping to write a new chapter in America's agricultural story. A chapter of reconciliation, regeneration, and respect for the wisdom embedded in the earth itself. Little did he know that the next phase of this remarkable journey would take him far beyond Oak Ridge Valley, to communities across the nation and eventually around the world, spreading the principles of the Harrison-Blackwood model to regions struggling with their own conflicts between development and preservation, between economic necessity and environmental responsibility. The seeds planted in that moment of confrontation 15 years earlier would continue to grow and spread, transforming landscapes both physical and cultural, and establishing a legacy that would outlive both its namesakes. And it all began because a weathered farmer refused to be silenced, and an auctioneer eventually found the courage to listen. 25 years after James Harrison was escorted from the Pinecrest County auction house, the autumn sun cast long shadows across Oak Ridge Valley as people gathered for the dedication ceremony at the newly completed James Harrison Memorial Park. What had once been the most contentious parcel of the Eagle Creek estate, the southeastern quadrant with its critical watershed, was now a protected nature preserve surrounded by thriving, sustainable farms. The land that had sparked a confrontation in an auction house 25 years earlier had become a living monument to transformed values and perspectives. Among the honored guests seated on the simple wooden platform was Vincent Blackwood, now in his early 90s. Though age had bent his once imposing frame and whitened what remained of his hair, his eyes remained sharp and observant. Beside him sat Daniel Harrison, now in his 80s, his gubernatorial and cabinet service years behind him, but his influence on rural policy still evident in the programs being celebrated today. As the crowd settled, Michael Harrison, James Harrison's grandson and the current Secretary of Agriculture, approached the podium. At 45, he carried echoes of his grandfather in his thoughtful demeanor and deep connection to the land. 25 years ago on this very ground, he began, two men stood as adversaries in a conflict that could have ended with bitterness and division. Instead, through wisdom and willingness to grow, they transformed that conflict into collaboration that has reshaped how we value and steward agricultural land across this nation. The gathered crowd included farmers and corporate executives, environmental advocates and development specialists, groups that had once seemed irreconcilably opposed, but now routinely worked together under the frameworks established through what had come to be known as the Harrison-Blackwood Accords. My grandfather was not a wealthy man when Vincent Blackwood had him escorted from that auction, Michael continued. He had already lost his own farm to economic hardship, but he understood something that transcended property ownership: that the soil itself carries wisdom that deserves to be heard and respected. In the front row, Rebecca Blackwood, Vincent's granddaughter and now CEO of Blackwood Sustainable Land Services, nodded in agreement. The company that had once specialized in selling farms to the highest bidder, regardless of intended use, now led the nation in facilitating land transfers that balanced economic value with environmental stewardship and community needs. What began that day wasn't just about a water covenant or a single auction, Michael explained. It was about a fundamental reconsideration of what gives land value, not just its development potential or per-acre price, but its ecological function, its cultural heritage, and its role in sustaining communities across generations. Behind the speaker's platform stood the centerpiece of the memorial park, a life-sized bronze sculpture depicting James Harrison and Vincent Blackwood seated on opposite ends of a fence, leaning toward each other in conversation. Their initial confrontation had evolved into years of collaboration that neither could have imagined on that fateful day at the auction house. When it came time for Vincent Blackwood to speak, he was helped to the podium by his granddaughter. The man who had once dismissed James Harrison as a weathered farmer with empty pockets now stood before the community as one of the most powerful advocates for the agricultural wisdom that farmers like Harrison had cultivated across generations. "I've lived a long life," Blackwood began, his voice softer than in his auctioneer days, but still carrying natural authority. "But I count the years following that confrontation with James Harrison as my most meaningful. He taught me, initially against my will, that the value of land cannot be reduced to its sale price, that its worth lies in relationships and functions that no deed or title can fully capture." Blackwood looked out over the watershed that James had fought to protect, now a thriving ecosystem that sustained both wildlife and the agricultural community surrounding it. I began that day thinking only of commissions and sale prices. James helped me see that true value lies in stewardship, in understanding that we hold land in trust for future generations. As Blackwood returned to his seat, Daniel Harrison approached the podium. Though he now walked with a cane, he carried himself with the same quiet dignity that had characterized his intervention 25 years earlier. "When I arrived at that auction with my convoy," he recalled, "I was simply trying to protect a water covenant and prevent my brother from being dismissed. I had no idea we were starting a movement that would eventually transform rural land policy across this country." He gestured toward the rolling hills of Oak Ridge Valley, where the Harrison-Blackwood principles had been implemented most comprehensively. "What you see around you isn't just preserved land, it's land that continues to produce, economically, ecologically, and culturally. We didn't choose between development and preservation. We found a third path that honors both progress and stewardship." The ceremony continued with the unveiling of a simple stone marker bearing words from James Harrison's book, The Soil Bears Witness, which had become a foundational text in agricultural education. The soil holds memory longer than any human institution. It responds not to our words or intentions, but to how we treat it. In this response lies our greatest lesson, that stewardship brings abundance, while exploitation ultimately yields scarcity. After the formal proceedings, the gathering transitioned to a community celebration held in the restored barn of the original Eagle Creek homestead. Tables laden with food produced by local farms stretched through the historic structure, tangible evidence of the agricultural vitality that had flourished under the Harrison-Blackwood approach. As dusk fell over Oak Ridge Valley, the memorial park's subtle lighting illuminated the bronze figures of James Harrison and Vincent Blackwood, their enduring conversation captured in metal that would outlast all those gathered to celebrate their legacy. The sculpture represented not just two individuals, but the principle they had come to embody: that wisdom emerges when different forms of knowledge are brought into respectful dialogue. The ceremony's final event took place at dusk, when the community gathered at the observation point overlooking the watershed that had been at the center of the original dispute. Solar-powered lanterns were distributed to everyone present, creating a constellation of lights that stretched across the hillside in the gathering darkness. Michael Harrison addressed the assembled community one last time. "My grandfather often said that the soil bears witness to how we treat it. Tonight, we acknowledge that we too must remember the wisdom of those who came before us, the lessons learned through conflict and collaboration, and our responsibility to those who will come after." At his signal, everyone raised their lanterns simultaneously, creating a moving tapestry of light across the landscape, a visual representation of the interconnected community that had emerged from principles established 25 years earlier. Vincent Blackwood, watching from his place of honor, felt the weight of the journey he had traveled